Hey guys, tonight we will be diving into a prehistoric survival story unlike anything I've covered before. We're talking 30,000 years ago, no tools, no shelter, no safety net. Just a small tribe of 17 people trying to survive one of the harshest winters the ancient world could throw at them. We're going to follow them from the last warm days of summer all the way through starvation, brutal storms, a cave lion that won't leave them alone, and the moment their leader dies and everything falls apart. And we're going to see how they piece it back together, or whether they can at all. This one is long, it is immersive, and I promise you it goes places I didn't expect when I first started reading it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now sit back and relax to a prehistoric world you've never seen before. Part 1. The River Camp. The river ran green in the mornings. It was the color of shallow water over pale stone, and in the early hours before the sun climbed the eastern ridge, it carried a mist that clung to the willows along its banks and made the world seem soft and without edges. Mara had watched that mist since she was small enough to be carried. She knew the way it moved, the way it thinned from the bottom first, the way it retreated upstream as the light strengthened. She knew it the way she knew her own hands. She crouched at the water's edge with a flat stone in her palm, watching a shoal of brown trout hang motionless against the current 50 arm lengths downstream. The trout were large this season. That was good. Everything that was large and fat was good, because everything large and fat would eventually become small and thin, and you wanted to have taken what you needed before that happened. Behind her, the camp breathed slowly into waking. The fire from the previous night had burned down to a dim red eye in the ash. Tala was already kneeling beside it, feeding it dry bark stripped from a birch log, blowing in long, careful breaths, coaxing it back. Tala always rose before light. She said the fire missed her when she slept, that it needed to know someone was watching. Mara had heard her say this so many times that she no longer thought of it as a belief, only as a fact about Tala. The camp was arranged in a loose crescent against the cut face of a low limestone bluff that rose perhaps 12 feet above the floodplain. The bluff kept the north wind from them in the night and held the day's warmth long after the sun dropped away. There were 17 of them now. 17 mouths. There had been 22 at the start of the warm season, but Ren had died of the swelling in his jaw 2 months past, and Luco's twins had come early and blue, and Paya had stepped into a hole crossing the north marshes and broken her leg so badly that the bone had torn through the skin, white and gleaming, and she had been dead by morning. 17. Kale said it was a good number. He said the spirits liked odd numbers, that even numbers made the world feel unfinished. Mara was not sure she believed in the spirits in the way Kale meant them, but she believed in Kale, and that amounted to much the same thing in practice. Kale himself sat a little apart from the main cluster of sleeping bodies, on a flat-topped boulder that he used as a chair in the mornings. He was wrapping a length of sinew around the hafting of a flint blade, working slowly and precisely, his fingers moving from long habit without needing his eyes. He was old, 43 winters, he sometimes said, and the saying of it always surprised people because they could not imagine such a number of winters. He was lean in the way of old hunters, the fat long gone from his face, the muscles of his arms ropey and defined, his knuckles swollen at every joint. His hair was iron gray, and he wore it twisted and knotted at the back of his neck. His left ear was missing its lobe, taken by something long ago, and the old scar tissue there had a shiny, almost translucent quality in morning light. Mara rose from the riverbank and walked back to the fire. The dewy grass soaked her feet immediately, but she was used to it. She crouched beside Tala and accepted a strip of dried horse meat from the older woman without being asked for it. It was hard as wood and tasted of smoke and old blood. She chewed it slowly, watching the camp. Bren was awake. She could tell by the quality of his stillness. He was lying wrapped in his arrowhide on the outer edge of the sleeping cluster, his back to the fire. But there was a tension in the set of his shoulders that sleeping bodies did not have. She did not call to him. She ate her meat strip and waited. and after a few moments he rolled over and looked at her across the dying embers with calm, dark eyes. He was 20 winters, perhaps 21. It was difficult to know exactly. His mother had not survived his birth, and there was no one who could say with certainty what season he had arrived in, only that it had been a hard season, and that detail was not much help because they were all hard seasons. He was broad through the shoulders and narrow in the face, with a long jaw and a habit of pinching his lower lip between two fingers when he was thinking. He was the best tracker among them, better even than Cale had been in his prime, though no one said this aloud. He got up, shook the dew from his hide, and came to the fire. Around them the camp came alive, the way it always did. Gradually, without ceremony, children sat up and were immediately hungry and said so. Mothers moved. Old Hem, who had a bad hip that locked in the night, worked himself upright with a series of suppressed sounds that were not quite words. Dunn, who was 18 and considered himself remarkable, stretched elaborately and looked around to see if anyone had noticed. Cale set down his hafted blade and looked at the sky. The sky above the river valley was a clear and ferocious blue. The blue of early autumn, when the air had already lost its thick summer humidity and become thin and bright. The birches along the water's edge had been yellowing for 2 weeks. The nights were sharp now, not cold enough to freeze, not yet, but cold enough to remind you that something was coming. Cold enough to make you think about firewood and fat stores and distance. "We need meat," Cale said. Not loudly. He never spoke loudly. His voice carried because everyone was accustomed to listening for it. Bren was already looking at the ridgeline to the south. The aurochs had been working the grasslands below that ridge for 3 days. He and Mara had seen their tracks yesterday, the wide spread of the hooves in the soft ground near the tree line. Some of the tracks so fresh that the edges had not yet crumbled. "South Ridge," Bren said. "Aurochs." Cale nodded slowly. He looked at Dunn. "Not Dunn," Mara said. Dunn straightened. His expression was the expression of a young man who had been slighted in front of an audience. "I brought down the stag last week," Dunn said. "You spooked the horses the week before that," Mara said. She was not trying to wound him. She was simply accounting. "We cannot afford spooked animals today." Cale looked at Dunn for a moment, then looked away. The looking away was its own kind of instruction. "Hem," Cale said. "Take Dunn. Work the west bank for fish and birds. Stay in sight of camp." Dunn's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Hem was already reaching for the fish spear. Cale chose his hunting party, the way he chose everything. Deliberately, without waste. Himself, Bren, Mara, 2 of the other men, Cord and Roven, both steady and experienced, and Sully, who was not yet 16 but who had a quality of absolute quiet in the field that older hunters rarely possessed. They took their spears and their throwing boards and a length of rope woven from twisted plant fiber and wet leather, and they moved out of camp in single file while the sun was still low and the shadows still long, heading south along the river until the bluff curved away and the valley opened into a broad flat meadow where the grass stood knee-high and golden. The hunting was a matter of patience first and everything else second. They found the aurochs 3 hours later in a shallow bowl at the base of the ridge. 11 of them, a mixed group of cows and young bulls, grazing in a widespread formation. The aurochs were enormous animals. An adult cow stood nearly as tall as a man at the shoulder, and the bulls were larger still, their horns sweeping out and forward in a long arc that could gut a hunter in half a heartbeat. They were not afraid of much. That was the danger of them, and also the thing that made them possible to approach on open ground, because an animal with no fear is not watching for predators with any great attention. They approached from downwind in a long patient crescent, using the grass and the slight undulations of the ground for cover. It took most of the morning. The sun had climbed to its midday position by the time they were close enough. Cale selected a young cow that had drifted slightly from the main group. He signaled with 2 fingers, indicating the flanking positions. Bren and Mara went left and right respectively, moving low, their spears held horizontal to their bodies to minimize their silhouette. Cord and Rovan moved to the animal's rear. Suli stayed with Kale. The young cow lifted her head once, her wide black nostrils working. Then Kale stood. The throw was perfect. 20 years of daily practice made it perfect. His atlatl cracked, and his spear took the cow behind the left shoulder, and she lurched forward, stumbling, and the rest of the herd exploded in a chaos of thunder and dust. Bren's spear hit the same animal's neck a moment later. She was running, but not cleanly, her right foreleg buckling with each stride, and Cord and Rovan were already cutting the angle, driving her back toward the low ground. Mara ran in from the side. It was always a controlled chaos, this last part. The moment between the animal being mortally wounded and the animal being dead was the most dangerous interval in hunting because a dying aurochs was still an aurochs. She had seen it kill men before. You stayed clear of the horns and the rear hooves, and you waited for the right moment, which came when the animal's head dropped and it began favoring one side, and then you moved in fast, below the sweep of the horns, and you drove your spear in behind the shoulder again, and held it there while the great body shuddered and settled. The cow died in a shallow depression in the golden grass with Mara's spear still in her and the September sun blazing down and the dust of the herd's flight still hanging in the air 200 paces away. Kale came and stood over the animal for a moment. He put one hand on the dead cow's shoulder. He spoke a few words in the old patterned speech that he used for the dead, the prayer language, the words Mara had heard all her life without ever quite learning them, because they were Kale's words, and he alone knew how to say them correctly. When he was done, he straightened and looked at Bren. "Start bleeding her," he said. "Let's get her back before dark." They worked efficiently and without conversation. Bleeding and gutting was hard, intimate work that you either learned to do cleanly or you wasted more than you took. Mara knew the geography of an aurochs body by heart, where the organs lay, which to save and which to discard, how to open the cavity without contaminating the meat with stomach content. They wrapped the organs they would eat in the animal's own stomach lining. They stripped the hide back from the haunches and divided the carcass into sections they could carry between two people on a frame cut from straight-grained young birch. Suli carried the hide alone, folded into a bundle nearly as large as herself, and did not complain. They came back to camp as the light turned copper and the river went gold, loaded with meat, and the entire camp came out to meet them. This was the ritual of a successful hunt. Everyone came, even Hem with his bad hip, even the smallest children, and there was a quality of attention in the greeting that was not quite celebration and not quite relief, but something of both. Tala had the main fire built up high. She put flat stones in the coals to heat. The meat went on the stones in thick slices, and the fat ran, and the smoke rose straight up in the still air, and the smell of it settled over the camp like a kind of warmth. They ate together, all 17 of them, as the stars appeared one by one above the river valley. Kale divided the portions with care, more to the children and to Luko, who was still recovering from her loss and who needed the blood-rich liver to rebuild herself. Hem gnawed his portion with the stubborn determination of a man refusing to acknowledge the sorry state of his teeth. Dunn ate quickly and asked for more and was given it without comment, because a young man who had been denied the hunt and had spent the day on fish duty deserved at least to be fed without grievance. After eating, Tala mixed red ochre with animal fat and water in a cupped stone bowl, working it into a thick paste with her thumb, and she daubed the marks on the limestone face of the bluff that she added to after every significant kill. Lines and shapes that accumulated over the seasons of their camping here. A record of animals taken, of hands pressed against stone, of things remembered and things asked for. Mara did not know exactly what all the marks meant. Some were clear, the hump and sweep of a bison, the branching antlers of a stag. Others were abstract, angular arrangements that carried meaning Mara could feel but not name. Bren sat beside her and watched Tala work in the firelight. His knee was touching her knee, and neither of them moved away from the contact. The geese flew over that night. Mara heard them in the dark, high and invisible, their honking carrying down through the cold, clear air from a height she could not see. She lay listening to them pass, wave after wave of them heading south, and she felt the familiar sensation that their passage always brought in her. Not quite fear, not quite urgency. Something older than both. The geese were not afraid. They simply knew what was coming and moved accordingly. She wished, sometimes, that it was that simple. Part 2. Signs. Here were signs. 3 days after the successful hunt, the lion came. Mara did not see it. She found its tracks in the morning, pressed deep into the mud at the river's edge 20 paces downstream from where they drew their water, and the tracks stopped her cold. She crouched over them for a long time, studying the spread of the pads, the clean absence of claw marks, the length of the stride. Cave lion, a large one, very likely a male. The prints were fresh enough that the edges of the pads were still sharp, not yet softened by drying. It had been here within the last few hours. She followed the tracks along the bank for 50 paces, noted where the animal had stopped and turned to look back at the camp, noted the depth of those stationary prints compared to the walking prints, which told her the lion had stood looking for some time. Then she went back to camp. Cale listened to her report without interrupting. When she was done, he asked 2 questions. How large and which direction did it leave? Very large, she said. It went north along the river and then turned east toward the high ground. He nodded. He did not look alarmed. He had seen many lions in 43 winters, and alarm was not, in his experience, a particularly useful response. He called the group together and told them quietly and without drama, "There is a large male cave lion in the area, likely territorial, possibly tracking us because of the smell of last night's kill. We keep the fire higher tonight. We do not go anywhere alone. The children do not go to the river unescorted." Dunn said, "We should track it and kill it." Cale looked at him. The look said many things without saying any of them aloud. "We do not hunt cave lions," Cale said. "But if it comes for us, we drive it off with fire and noise and spears. We do not hunt it. Hunting it is how you die." Dunn pressed his lips together and said nothing more. But Mara saw the expression on his face and noted it. Dunn was at an age where being told what not to do was nearly indistinguishable from being challenged. It was a dangerous quality in any person. In a young man with a spear and a need to prove something, it was a specific kind of danger. She took Bren aside after the meeting. "Watch Dunn," she said. Bren nodded. He had already been watching him. They kept the fires high for 2 nights, and the lion did not come. On the 3rd night, Mara sat the 3rd watch, the deepest dark before dawn, and she saw the lion. It came out of the willow scrub along the river about 40 paces from the fire perimeter. She saw it because the fire threw just enough light to make the darkness beyond it slightly differentiated, not illuminated but less than absolute, and the lion's pale coat caught some faint fraction of that light. It was enormous. Even at 40 paces in near darkness, she could gauge its scale against the willows, and it was bigger than she had imagined from the tracks. Its head swung slowly as it looked at the camp. It was not crouching. It was not stalking. It was simply standing and looking with the absolute calm of an animal that understood itself to be the largest living thing in any landscape it inhabited. Mara did not call out. She picked up a burning branch from the fire and held it high and took 3 slow steps toward the darkness. The lion's eyes caught the firelight, 2 dim amber coins floating in the black. Then they blinked out as the animal turned, and she heard the willows move, and it was gone. She stood with the burning branch raised for another count of 30 before she lowered it. Her heartbeat was remarkable. She could feel it in her fingertips. In the morning, she told Cale what she had seen. He listened, and then was silent for a while, in the way he went silent when he was thinking something through to its end before speaking. "We have been here too long," he said finally. They had been at the river camp since midsummer. It was productive ground, water close and reliable, good stands of hazel and blackberry, regular game on the grasslands to the south, and the bluff at their backs. But the Arawak's kill had drawn other things. The smell of blood and rendered fat had likely been what pulled the lions south from the high ground, and where there was one lion, there were often others. Cale told them to begin preparing to move. This announcement was received with a range of reactions that told Mara exactly what she already knew about each person. Tala began immediately and wordlessly breaking down her arrangements at the fire pit, sorting what was portable from what would be left behind. Bren asked which direction and then began thinking about it with his characteristic inward focus. Luco's face went tight with the particular anxiety of a woman who had recently lost children, and for whom any change in circumstances felt like another edge to stand too close to. Oldham sighed with the weariness of a man for whom every journey was now a renegotiation of his body's limits. Dunn looked pleased, which meant he had been bored, which was its own kind of warning. There was a place, 2 days' walk to the southwest, where a limestone escarpment curved around a south-facing slope. Cale had used it before, years ago, before many of the younger ones were born. The slope caught the sun from mid-morning to late afternoon, even in deep winter, which was significant. There was a shallow cave high enough in the escarpment to be safe from floods and from most ground predators, and there was a stream below it that ran clear year-round from a spring higher up, which did not freeze completely, even in the hardest months. They would go there. It would take 2 days in good conditions. The first day was straightforward enough, southwest along the river, then south through mixed forest toward the grasslands proper, then into the hill country beyond. The second day was harder, crossing the hill country to the escarpment, and there was a river to ford that would be running full from the autumn rains. They spent 2 days preparing. They smoked as much of the remaining meat as the fire would produce in that time, wrapping the dried strips in birch bark parcels sealed with pine resin. They packed their tools, the core stones and prepared flakes and finished blades, the awls and needles made of bone, the hides at various stages of preparation. Tala packed her ochre and her small stones and her bundles of dried herb and the flat piece of sandstone she used for grinding seeds, which was heavy but which she would not leave. The sleeping hides were rolled and tied with cord. They made frames for the heavier loads from green poles cut at the river. The poles bent and lashed into carrying shapes. Mara found herself making an inventory of everything twice, 3 times. It was a habit learned from Cale. You counted what you had. You counted it again. You thought about what you would need that you did not have, and you either acquired it or you accepted its absence and thought about how you would manage without it. Acceptance and preparation were the same motion in 2 different directions. On the morning they left, Tala spent a long time at the bluff face, her hand pressed flat against the stone beneath the accumulated marks of their seasons here. She did not make any new marks. She stood with her palm on the limestone, and her eyes closed and her lips moving soundlessly, for nearly the time it takes the sun to move a hand's width across the sky. No one disturbed her. Then she picked up her pack and turned away from the bluff, and they began to walk. Part 3. The Crossing. The first day went well enough. The forest received them with the dense silence of autumn, the canopy still holding most of its color, but the smell of the ground already turning rich and fungal. The damp leaves softening underfoot, the light coming through in slanted columns where the higher branches had already thinned. Mara walked near the front with Bren, reading the ground, watching the spaces between the trees. The children were kept in the middle of the column with Luco and 2 others. Cale walked where he could see the full group, neither leading nor following, but somehow managing both. They flushed a small herd of red deer from a thicket in mid-morning, and the deer vanished into the trees to the east without pause, and everyone watched them go, because the question of whether to pursue was always present and always had to be decided quickly. Cale made a small gesture. Let them go. They had enough smoked meat for several days, and a deer pursuit now would scatter the group and cost time they did not want to spend on the move. The deer's passage through the thicket had disturbed something else, though. Mara stopped and held up a hand, and the column stopped behind her. She was looking at a mark on a birch tree at the thicket's edge. Someone had scored the bark, 3 parallel cuts, deep and deliberate, at approximately chest height. The cuts were not fresh, perhaps a week old, the exposed wood already drying and beginning to curl at the edges. She examined the height and spacing of the cuts for a moment. She looked at Bren. He had already seen it. His expression was neutral in the way that meant he was thinking fast. She stepped back and looked around the thicket, widening her attention. 20 paces to the left, on a second birch, another mark. Same height, different pattern. A single long diagonal cut with 2 shorter cuts below it. Territory markers, Bren said quietly. Yes, Mara said. Another group had been here within the last 2 weeks. The marks were placed at eye level for a person of average height. They were cuts made with a sharp stone blade, not claw marks, not the random scoring of an animal. This was communication. We were here. This is ours. The precise meaning of the second mark, the diagonal, and 2 shorter cuts, she did not know, because different groups used different arrangements of signs. She brought Kale forward to look. He studied the marks without touching them. He looked at the ground around the base of the tree and found what she had already found. Faint traces of several sets of footprints in the leaf duff, partially obscured by time and rain and the falling of leaves, but present. He stood for a time. How many, he asked. Hard to say. 6. Maybe 8. He straightened. He looked southwest, toward the hill country, the direction they were going. We keep moving, he said, but quietly, and everyone stays close. The mood in the group shifted. Mara felt it without seeing it, the way you feel a change in the current of a river before the water itself changes. Fear was not the right word for what these people felt when the signs of another group appeared. It was more complex than fear. It was the particular tension of not knowing whether what you were about to encounter was dangerous or useful, enemy or potential ally, people who would take from you, or people you might trade with. There was no single answer. Groups that had cooperated for years could turn hostile if circumstances changed. Groups that had been hostile could become necessary to each other when winter reduced everyone's margins. You could not afford too much trust. You could not afford too little. They made camp that night in the open at the forest's southern edge, with the grasslands spreading away to the south, in the fading light, and the hill country rising beyond that, and the sky above it all, going from orange to red to a bruised purple, and then the stars. No one slept deeply. Mara sat 2 of the 3 watches herself, trading only the middle watch with Bren, and in the gray pre-dawn she scanned the tree line behind them and the grasslands ahead and found nothing. No firelight in the trees, no silhouettes on the grassland in the moonlight. If the other group was near, they were as careful as her people were. The second day began with a cold that announced itself. Mara woke from her few hours of shallow sleep to a sky that had changed. The brilliant blue of the previous days was gone. In its place, a high, pale overcast had moved in from the northwest during the night, the kind of sky that flattened everything and drained color and made it difficult to read the time from the sun's position. The air tasted different, sharper. There was moisture in it that had not been there the day before. Kale looked at the sky for a long time before he said anything. We need to cross the river before midday, he said. If the weather comes in fast, we do not want to be at the crossing in heavy rain. They ate quickly and broke camp and were moving within the time it takes to lose feeling and fingers left unprotected in the cold. The children were quieter this morning. Children understood weather instinctively, Mara thought. They knew when to stop wasting energy on noise. The hill country was rougher going than the river valley or the forest. The ground was broken by outcrops of limestone and dense patches of hawthorn scrub, and the grass on the south-facing slopes was already brittle and brown, slippery with frost in the shadowed hollows. Mara picked the line of travel with care, looking for firm ground, avoiding the clay-bottom draws where livestock and deer had churned the wet earth into a treacherous mud. Hem's hip was worse in cold weather, and she could see the effort each uneven step cost him in the set of his jaw. She found the easier lines without making a show of finding them. They reached the river at mid-morning. It was not the same river as their camp. This was a different waterway, shorter and faster, fed by springs in the limestone hills and running swift and opaque with suspended clay after days of rain. In summer it ran clear and knee-deep, and a child could cross it jumping stone to stone. Now it was thigh-deep at the ford and running hard, the water brown-gray and cold as iron, and the crossing stones were submerged and invisible. Kale studied the river for a long time from the bank. Rope, he said. They had the length of woven rope in their packs, They tied it to a young oak at the near bank, and Cale took the free end and waded in. He was old, and he knew rivers, and he moved carefully, sideways, facing upstream so the current hit his body at an angle rather than pushing directly against him, the rope taut behind him, his spear planted in the riverbed as a third leg. The water came up above his waist at the deepest point, and for a moment he slowed completely, standing entirely still, reading the current's pressure through his legs. Then he was past the deep part and moving again, and in another 30 counts he was at the far bank. He tied his end to a second tree. The rope now spanned the river in a gentle sag, and they crossed one by one, hand over hand along the rope, the water pulling at legs and hips with an urgency that was not violent but was absolutely serious. Mara went second to last, supervising the crossing, watching each person come safely to the far bank. The children she sent with adults holding their hands, the rope a guide rather than a lifeline. Cord lifted the 2 youngest children above the water altogether, one tucked under each arm, and waded across, making it look easier than it was. Hem was difficult. His bad hip made the sideways stance nearly impossible, and partway across he stumbled and went down to his knees in the current, the water washing over his chest, and he grabbed the rope with both hands with an animal desperation, and Mara was in the water behind him before she had consciously decided to move. She got her shoulder under his arm and lifted, and they struggled together to the far bank and sat in the mud and breathed for a while. Hem was shaking, but it was from cold more than fear. He had a hunter's pride that refused to be diminished by rivers. "Thank you," he said, quietly enough that only she would hear. She helped him up. They were all across, except that Mara had not looked at Dunn. She did not know when he had left. He was there when they reached the river, and she had assumed he was there still, somewhere in the group. But when she counted heads, she came up one short, and the one who was missing was Dunn. She felt something cold in her chest that was not the river. "Where is Dunn?" she said. Rovan looked around. Cord looked around. Cale's face went very still. "He was here," Rovan said. "I saw him before the crossing." Bren was already looking back across the river, scanning the far bank and the hill slopes above it with that focused, quick attention that his eyes always had when he was tracking. "There," he said. He pointed. Dunn was half a mile up the slope above the far bank, picking his way across a limestone outcrop, moving northeast. He had his spear. He was moving with purpose. Mara looked where Dunn was going. Northeast. Up the hill and over the ridgeline, in the direction of the territory markers they had found the previous day. She said a word under her breath that she rarely said. Cale was beside her. "He's going after the other group," she said. Cale did not answer immediately. He watched Dunn's receding figure for a long moment, and she watched Cale's face, and what she saw on it was not anger. It was something heavier. Something close to grief. She started toward the water. Cale's hand came down on her shoulder. "No," he said. "We have to go after him." "No," Cale said again. "If we go back across that river and follow him, we lose half the day. We lose the crossing at the good water level. And if he has already made contact with that group, our chasing after him may make things worse. So we leave him. We wait," Cale said. "We make camp at the escarpment. We wait one night. If he has not come by morning, we will decide." She looked at him. She had never looked at Cale and found him wrong before. Exactly. But she had sometimes found him making the calculation that saved the most people at the cost of one. And she had learned to recognize the particular flatness of his voice when he was making that calculation now. He was not wrong. He was doing what a leader does, which is to weigh the group against the individual and make the arithmetic work. She turned away from the river. They walked the last 3 miles to the escarpment in silence. Part 4. The escarpment. The place was as Cale had described it. The limestone escarpment rose from the hillside in a long gray curve, south-facing, the rock face pocked with holes and shallow recesses, and, near the eastern end, a proper cave, not deep, perhaps 15 paces from entrance to back wall, but wide and with a ceiling high enough to stand in and a floor of dry, compacted earth. The entrance faced slightly east of south, which meant it got morning light and was sheltered from the prevailing north and west winds. There was a dark streak on the ceiling above the entrance that spoke of many previous fires. Others had used this place before, perhaps many others, perhaps for generations. Below the escarpment, the slope ran down to a flat bench of land thick with hazel and rowan, and below that the spring-fed stream that Cale had promised. The stream ran clear and cold from a fissure in the limestone 50 paces upslope, and it ran without pause, the kind of water that did not lie and did not disappear. Mara looked at the cave and the stream and the south-facing warmth still in the rock face even on this overcast afternoon, and she felt something release in her chest. "This will do," she said. They set up quickly, with the efficiency of people who had made and broken camp many times. Cale directed the placement of things as he always did, not with words usually, but with position. The fire went here, in a natural bowl of stone near the cave entrance where the smoke would drift outward and up the rock face rather than pooling inside. Sleeping arrangements went deepest in the cave, where the cold was held at bay longest. Tools and food stores went on ledges in the rock walls. The hides were arranged so that the sleeping area could be partially enclosed with them in extreme cold. Tala found a smooth section of cave wall and spent an hour examining it in the fading light, pressing her palm flat against the stone, reading it somehow in a way Mara had never understood and never tried to. "Good stone," Tala said. "Good place." Coming from Tala, this was a significant endorsement. The overcast thickened through the afternoon, and by dusk it had begun to rain. Not hard, not yet, but a cold, persistent rain that made the grasslands below the escarpment disappear behind a gray curtain. They were all inside the cave or under the overhang above the entrance when it began, and no one had to say that this was fortunate. They ate sparingly that evening. Smoked meat and some dried berries that Luco had gathered 2 days before the move, and hot water boiled with certain herbs that Tala said were good for the cold in the bones. The fire was smaller than Mara would have liked, conserving fuel, because gathering more would mean going out into the rain. She sat at the cave entrance and looked at the rain coming down in the darkness and thought about Dunn. He was stupid. Not in the way of a person who lacks capacity, but in the way of a person who has not yet understood that the world is not interested in what he wants it to be. He wanted to prove himself the way young men always wanted to prove themselves, as if the proof could be collected and held onto rather than simply lived. She had never known a young man who came back from the kind of proving he went off to do and said, "Yes, I understand now. I see why that was wrong." They came back changed, if they came back, and the change was in them like a scar. She did not want Dunn to not come back. He came back before midnight. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of footsteps on the slope below the escarpment, uneven, someone moving fast but not smoothly. She had a spear in her hand before she was fully upright, and she moved to the cave entrance and stood in it and called out. He answered. His voice was wrong. She went down the slope to meet him with a burning brand from the fire, and found him at the base of the escarpment, soaked through and breathing hard, his left forearm pressed tight against his stomach, and his right hand clamped over it. She held the light up to see. The gash ran from his wrist to his elbow on the inside of his forearm. It was not clean. Something with a jagged edge had done it, stone or bone, and it had gone deep enough to be serious. In the firelight, the edges of the wound were gaping and dark with blood. She got him up the slope. He did not explain himself that night. He was in shock, his face yellow pale in the firelight, his eyes glassy. Tala was the healer among them in the matter of wounds and illness, and she examined the gash with the detached focus of someone inventorying a problem. She pressed the edges together to see how the wound behaved. She smelled it. She looked at Dunn's fingertips, which were warm enough. Nothing vital cut, she said to Mara, but deep, must be closed. She cleaned the wound with the boiled water, which made Dunn make a sound he would later be embarrassed by. She pressed dried herbs that she had been carrying since the river camp into the wound's depth. Plants whose names Mara knew, but whose properties she knew only approximately. Things that slowed bleeding, things that fought the rot that could grow in a wound's darkness. Then she brought the edges together and closed the wound with small strips of wet leather that shrank as they dried. Binding the edges tight, Dunn would not lose the arm, but he would not be hunting or carrying heavy loads for some time. Cale sat beside him when the wound was dressed and the worst of the cold was out of him. "What happened?" Cale said. The other group was closer than they thought. Dunn had crossed the ridge and come down on them in a rocky valley less than 2 miles from where they had found the territory markers. He had not meant to walk into their camp. He had meant to observe them from a distance, but they had sentries posted on the high ground, and the sentries had seen him before he saw them, and he had been surrounded by 4 men before he understood what was happening. They had not killed him. That told Mara several things. They had taken his spear and then given it back, which told her more. They had communicated, not in the same tongue, but with enough common words and with hands and expression, enough to convey the basics. Their group was larger than Dunn had expected. 15, perhaps 20 people. They too were moving south and southwest, away from the coming winter in the north. They had not been hostile, exactly, but they had been emphatic about the territory markers, emphatic in a way that required a stone tool drawn across a forearm to communicate properly. "You're lucky it was only that," Cale said. Dunn said nothing. "You nearly brought them to us," Cale said. "Tonight. Tomorrow. You nearly made a problem for 17 people because you wanted to see something." Dunn was still not speaking. Cale looked at him for a long time. "Sleep," he said. "We will talk more in the morning." He stood and walked to the cave entrance, and stood looking out at the rain, and Mara went to stand beside him. "Are they a danger?" she asked. "Meaning the other group?" "Any group is a danger when resources are limited," Cale said. "But they did not kill a scout who walked into their camp uninvited. That is something." He was quiet for a moment. "In the morning we will send someone to them," he said. "Properly. With gifts." "What gifts?" Mara said, thinking of their stocks. "Rope," he said. "We can make more. Rope is always useful, and it says we can make things, that we have skills worth having. And dried meat, if we can spare it, which we cannot, so we spare it anyway." She looked at him. He was tired in a way she had not seen before. Not the tiredness of a long day or a hard hunt, but something underneath the daily tiredness. Something structural. "You should sleep," she said. He shook his head once, slowly. "Not yet." She left him there, watching the rain. Part 5. What is taken? 3 days at the escarpment. The rain went on, not the dramatic, punishing rain of a summer storm, the kind that arrived with thunder and left inside an hour. This was the slow, gray, absolute rain of autumn in the hill country, the kind that was barely more than very wet air, barely distinguishable from mist, but that soaked everything given enough hours. It darkened the rock of the escarpment and ran in slow, thin sheets down the cave walls and made the slope below a treacherous slick of clay. The stream below them ran higher. The clear spring water mixed now with brown surface runoff, but it ran and they had water. The firewood was the problem. What was inside the cave was dry. What was on the slope and in the hazel scrub below was soaked. They broke the dry wood carefully and used the small stuff for the main fire and kept the large pieces against the back wall where the rock held the least moisture. Mara went out twice a day to gather what she could. The wet wood could be stacked near the fire to dry, but it took time, and time was the one thing they were spending most of. On the second day she took stock of the food. The smoked meat was enough for perhaps 5 more days if she rationed it. The dried berries were already gone, eaten the first evening. There were some dried tubers, stringy and tasting of earth, that Tala had packed, enough for 3 or 4 servings. After that they needed fresh food, and fresh food in this rain and this cold was not coming to them. They would have to go and find it. She sat with her inventory and looked at it and felt the weight of 17 people sit down on her shoulders. Bren was sitting across the fire from her, working the edge off a new flint blade with a piece of antler, the rhythmic tapping filling the cave with a steady small sound. He looked up at her face, and she did not need to explain the numbers. "When the rain breaks," he said. "If the rain breaks," she said, "it will break." She looked at the cave ceiling, at the dark stain of 100 previous fires. All those people who had sat here before her in the rain, she thought, and most of them had lived. That was something. Kale coughed in the night. She heard it from the edge of sleep, a deep, wet, rattling cough that subsided and then returned, deeper and longer the second time. She lay still and listened. He coughed 3 more times, each bout longer, and then was quiet. She heard him move, heard the sound of him drinking from the water skin, heard him settle again. In the morning she looked at him and said nothing. She had known for weeks that something was working in his chest. The winter before last he had caught a lung sickness that had kept him bedridden for 20 days, the longest she had ever seen him incapacitated. He had recovered, but Tala had told her privately, in the particular careful understatement that Tala used for serious things, that lungs, once they knew that sickness, remembered it. The cold finds the path it has made before. Kale ate his morning ration and was on his feet and making plans before the camp was fully awake, and Mara watched him and said nothing. On the 3rd day the rain softened, and by late morning it stopped. The sky did not open into blue. It remained a solid pewter gray, low and windless, the light flat and even and without shadow. But the rain was done. They went out immediately. Mara took Bren and Suli and Cord, and they went down the slope and into the hazel scrub, looking for anything. Hazelnuts still on the branches, late and small but present. A stand of dried thistle with seeds still clinging to the heads. The mushrooms that came after rain on fallen wood. Some of them were good eating, some were not, and knowing which was a life-saving distinction that Tala had drilled into Mara since childhood. She gathered only the ones she was certain of. They found a doe deer in the hazel scrub, a young one, its legs sunk to the knees in the clay soil of a low hollow, unable to pull free. It had been there long enough to be weakened, its eyes sunken, its breathing shallow. She killed it quickly with a single thrust and felt the mercy in the action as much as the necessity. They came back to the escarpment with the doe and the mushrooms and the hazelnuts and an armful of wet wood that would dry by evening. And the mood in the camp lifted visibly at the sight of fresh meat. Tala was sitting at the cave entrance. She stood when she saw them coming, and her face had an expression on it that Mara had not seen before. And the expression made Mara stop walking. "Tala," she said. Tala came down the slope to meet her. The others went past them with the meat and the firewood, and Tala waited until they were past. "It is Kale," she said. Mara set down the mushrooms she was carrying. She followed Tala into the cave. He was at the back, propped against a folded hide, his eyes open. He was breathing, but the breath was audible from 10 paces, a wet, thick sound that was not breath at all in the normal sense, but something labored and mechanical, as if someone inside him was operating bellows that had partly collapsed. She knelt beside him. His eyes found her, and he looked at her with the clear attention that she associated with him. The eyes of a man who had always been fully present in whatever was happening to him. "How long?" she asked Tala. Tala made a small, careful gesture. She did not know. A day, 2 days, not more. Mara looked at Kale. He wanted to speak. She could see him preparing for it, gathering the breath. When he did speak, his voice was very quiet, and she had to lean close to hear it. "You know what to do," he said. She put her hand on his hand. "Tell me anyway," she said. He almost smiled. He did not give her a speech. Kale was not a man for speeches, and she would not have wanted one. He told her 3 things, the 3 things he most wanted said, and she held them without answering because they did not require an answer, only receiving. The first was about the other group. "Make contact," he said. "Do not be afraid of them, but do not be careless. They are people." The second was about Dunn. "He is not what he seems yet," Kale said. "Neither are you." The third was about fire. "Keep the fire going," he said. "Everything else can be replaced. Fire cannot. Fire is what makes the dark different from the light." She sat with him through the afternoon. Others came and went. Tala kept the small fire burning beside him, closer and hotter than the main fire, and she burned certain dried leaves that smelled of resin and something darker underneath, and she spoke to him in the old prayer language, the words that Mara had always wanted to learn and never quite managed to. He lost consciousness near dark. He died in the night, quietly, between Mara's second watch and the dawn. She sat at the cave entrance and looked at the dark sky until the light came. Part 6. After. The grief was not small, and it was not simple, and she did not try to make it either of those things. They spent a day preparing the place. Tala chose a site on the slope above the escarpment, a flat-topped outcrop with a view south over the valley below and the hill country beyond. And they brought Cale there and laid him on the stone. Tala marked the stone with ochre, the long line that meant a life extending beyond sight, the small marks she added around it that Mara did not have names for. She stayed with the body through the day, speaking to him, and no one questioned this or hurried it. There was a ritual that involved fire. Tala made a small fire on the outcrop and fed it with a piece of birch bark she had carried rolled and dry in the innermost part of her pack, and the bark burned with a pale yellow flame that the wind took almost immediately, the smoke streaming south-like direction. In the smoke, Tala placed a handful of dried sage and a pinch of something red and powdery that Mara did not ask about. The smoke changed color and the smell was sharp and clean and strange. They were all there, all 17 of them. Even Hem, who could barely manage the slope. Even Dunn, whose arm was still wrapped, and who stood a little apart from the group, with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but occupied the territory between them. Mara spoke. She had not planned what to say, and she said what came, which was mostly true and mostly about what she had seen of Cale in 22 years of living beside him. She said the things you say when someone who made the world feel navigable is gone, that the knowing they gave you does not leave with them, that the paths they found are still there in the ground, that the fire they kept is still burning. She believed some of it as she said it. She hoped the rest would become true. After the ritual, they went back to the cave and ate the meat she and the others had brought in the day before, and nobody spoke much. Children fell asleep in their parents' arms and were laid down carefully. Bren sat beside Mara and did not speak but was present, which was what she needed from him. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the cave entrance and thought about the 17 people behind her, and she thought about winter, which was not coming but was already here in every way that mattered. She thought about the other group in the valley to the northeast, 15 or 20 of them, also moving south, also watching the sky. She thought about food and warmth and the exponential relationship between cold and the calories you needed to maintain the body's heat. She thought about Dunn's arm and Hem's hip, and Luco's grief, and Suli's remarkable capability, and Bren's steady, undemonstrative competence. She thought about what Cale had told her. Keep the fire going. Everything else can be replaced. In the morning, she called the group together. She did not ask them to follow her. She knew what Cale would have thought of that. You do not ask for leadership, he had told her once. Leadership is what you do while everyone else is doing something else. But she told them what she saw and what she thought and what she intended, and she invited disagreement. And when Dunn opened his mouth, she held up a hand and looked at him with the same flat patience she had watched Cale use for years. What I propose, she said, is this. We send 2 people to make contact with the other group. We send them with rope and a portion of meat, and we send them with Dunn, because Dunn has already met these people, and they have seen his face and decided not to kill him, which makes him our best introduction. Dunn's expression changed. We offer them a meeting, she continued, a sharing. We are going to need more people to hunt effectively this winter, and they are going to need a territory they understand, which we have more knowledge of than they do. We have something to offer each other, so we offer it. She looked around the group. Hem was watching her with something that was not quite approval, because Hem had been watching people for too many winters to express approval easily, but was perhaps its equivalent. Tala nodded. One small, definitive nod. Bren was already thinking about logistics. She could see him doing it. What else? Cord said. We hunt, she said. Today, rain or not. We need more food in store before this cold settles in hard. I will lead the hunt. Bren and Cord and Roven and Suli. We go after aurochs or bison, whatever we can find on the south grassland. We do not come back empty. She paused. Cale would have asked what the spirits want, she said. I cannot speak for the spirits, and I will not pretend to, but I know what the people want. They want to eat. They want to be warm. They want to see the spring. She looked at each face in turn. So do I, she said. So we do what it takes. They moved. Part 7. The Hunt and the Meeting. The south grasslands were changed by the rain. The long grass lay flattened in patches where runoff had moved across it, and the low points of the ground were pooled with standing water that reflected the gray sky in dull gray mirrors. The distance had a washed quality, as if the rain had softened the edges of the world and had not yet let them harden again. Mara walked at the front of the hunting party with a spear in one hand and the throwing board slung at her hip, reading the ground. She had slept 3 hours in total in the last 2 days. She was aware of this as a fact about her body, the way you were aware of a stone in your shoe, present, affecting your movement, but not stopping it. They found sign within the first hour. Bison, not aurochs, a wide swath of grazed ground where the grass had been cropped to stubs, and at its edges the heavy crescent prints of bison hooves in the soft clay. The sign was fresh. The cropped grass at the edge of the grazed area was still slightly pale, where cut, not yet yellowed by air and time. The herd was ahead of them. Sully went forward alone to look. This was what Sully did. She disappeared into the landscape the way water disappeared into porous stone, and 15 minutes later she came back with the information as if she had simply stepped around a corner. 20, she said. North side of the low ridge. Moving slow. 20 bison was a large group, and a large group of bison was not something 5 people should attempt without considerable care. But 5 people who knew what they were doing, with the wind right and the ground right and the right animal identified, could do something useful even with a herd of that size. Mara thought about it for the time it takes to breathe slowly 3 times. We do not hunt the herd, she said. We look for a single animal that has separated. Old, young, lame. There will be one. Sully nodded. She had seen one, Mara realized. She was waiting to be asked. An old bull, Sully said, grazing on the near side of the ridge, maybe 100 paces from the main group. Take us to him, Mara said. The old bull was magnificent and pathetic in the way of very old animals, still enormous, his winter coat just beginning to come in thick and shaggy around his massive shoulders. But one of his hind legs was not working correctly, the hip joint gone bad, and he was compensating with every step. He would not survive the winter. That was not sentimentality, it was reading the body's evidence. The bone loss in his hip meant he could not flee predators effectively, could not maintain the walking pace the herd would require as they moved south through the cold months, and he was already separated from the main group by more distance than was healthy, which meant the herd knew it too. The wind was from the south. They were approaching from the south. As long as they stayed below the ridge line, they were invisible, and their scent was carried away from him. She assigned positions with hand signals, Cord and Roven to the left, angling wide to come up on his good side, Sully to hold at distance with a second spear ready, Bren to her right. She gave herself the first throw. The approach took time. No rushing. The ground was cooperative, the wet grass absorbing footfalls, the ridge providing the cover they needed until they were 60 paces away, and then the ridge ended and there was only open grassland between them and the bull. She stood, the bull's head came up and around, and his black eyes found her immediately. He was old, but he was not stupid. He assessed her in one long look, the look of an animal that has seen predators all its life and knows exactly what it is seeing. He began to move, awkward and rolling, the bad hip dropping with each stride. She threw. The atlatl gave the spear a range and force that the arm alone could not achieve, and the spear crossed 60 paces and struck the bull behind the left shoulder with a sound like a green branch snapping. He stumbled but did not fall, and then he was moving faster, the adrenaline overriding the hip for the moment, and Bren's spear hit him in the neck, and he began to slow. Cord and Roven came in from the left at a run. Cord's throw was low, into the hindquarters, which would not kill but would further compromise the hip. Rovin's spear hit the same shoulder as Mara's first throw, and the bull lurched sideways and went down to his knees. Mara was running. She knew how to do this part. She had learned it from Kale when she was young enough that it was terrifying, and she had done it enough times since that it was only serious. She came in from behind the shoulder, away from the horns, and she drove her second spear in with both hands behind it, leaning her full weight into the thrust, and the great body shuddered and the legs scrambled without purchase on the wet grass, and the bull settled sideways onto the ground. She stood over him with her chest heaving and her arms trembling. He was looking at her. His eye was enormous and dark, and the fire in it was going, and she held his gaze until it was gone. And then she stood back and breathed. She said the words that she knew. Not the prayer language. She did not know that, but the words she had made from her own understanding of what was taken and what was owed. Short and plain. She thanked the animal for its life. She promised that none of it would be wasted. Then they worked. They were gone from that place before the wolves found the blood smell. Back at the escarpment by mid-afternoon, loaded with meat and fat and hide, the camp received them the same way it had at the river. Everyone coming out. The quality of relief in the greeting. Tala looked at the load of fat. Autumn fat. The thick, creamy fat that an animal laid on before winter, which was different in quality and caloric weight from the lean summer flesh. She looked at the quantity of it, and she smiled, which was an expression that reorganized her entire face into something younger. Good, she said. Good. While Mara had been hunting, Dunn had been making contact. He came back to the escarpment a few hours after the hunting party, moving faster than his arm should have let him, and he had 3 people with him, 2 men and a woman, all adults, all carrying spears but holding them the way you held a spear when you wanted to show it was not raised in threat. Pointed down, grip loose. They stopped at the base of the escarpment slope and did not come up without being invited. Mara came down to meet them. The older of the 2 men was perhaps 35, which was not old but was experienced in a landscape this unforgiving. He was shorter than Bren and wider through the chest, with a scar across one cheekbone and eyes that were actively intelligent and also watchful in the particular way of a person who has learned to read danger quickly. He looked at Mara, and he looked at the escarpment and the fire visible at the cave entrance and the people moving around it, and his assessment was comprehensive and fast. She held out the rope, 12 arm lengths of it, tightly woven, the best they had. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took it with both hands, which was the correct gesture for receiving something offered. 2 hands meant you were not holding a weapon. He said something in his own tongue. She caught a word that was similar to a word in hers. Warmth or shelter. It was not precisely clear. She answered in her own tongue. Shelter. Yes. Fire. Come. It was not a sophisticated conversation. It was barely a conversation at all. But the rope changed hands, and she stepped back, and the 3 of them came up the slope, and no one on the escarpment made a threatening movement, and the fire was burning, and the meat was cooking, and the smell of it was without ambiguity. They sat together that evening at the cave entrance, her people and these 3, and they ate together. And what passed between the groups was not words so much as information carried through gesture and tone, and the universal language of people sharing food in the dark. She learned that the other man's name was something like Var. The woman was called something with a click in it she could not reproduce. The older man, the one who had taken the rope, had a name she heard as Sorn, through Dunn, who had managed to accumulate a handful of shared words in his afternoon with them. She learned that their group was 14 people now, having lost 4 in the summer. They were heading for a river valley to the southwest that Sorn described with his hands. A wide valley, sheltered, with good hunting. She knew the valley he meant. She had been there twice with Kale, through the same channel she told him where they were going, which was here, this escarpment, this winter. The valley he described was perhaps a day's walk further southwest. They were not competing for the same ground. The tension that had been in the air since the moment Dunn crossed the ridge and walked into their camp began, slowly, to change, not to disappear. Trust was not built in an evening, but the shape of the tension changed. the way a knot changes when you find the right end of it and pull. Sorn unrolled a piece of thin scraped hide from inside his pack and laid it on the ground between them. On it were marks made in charcoal, lines that represented the landscape. Mara realized looking at them, the river, the hills, the escarpment, a mark where the valley lay. He pointed to various marks and said words, and she listened and watched, and gradually a map began to assemble itself in her understanding. He was telling her what the territory was like, what was in it, where things were. He was sharing knowledge. She thought of Kale saying, "They are people." She thought of him saying it in the way you state something self-evident, the way you would say, "The sky is above us," as if it should not need to be said, but sometimes needs to be said anyway. She nodded. She pointed to the marks on his hide and confirmed what she recognized. She added her own knowledge with a finger drawn across the leather, a spring she knew of that his lines did not show, a passage through the hill country on the eastern side that avoided the worst of the clay ground, a place on the south grassland where the bison wintered and which could be found by a certain rock formation that stood out from the otherwise flat ground like a sentinel. They looked at each other across the marked leather. He said something that she did not understand. She said something that he did not understand. They both understood the meaning. Part 8. The storm. It came 3 days later. There had been signs, as there always were if you were paying attention. The kind of cold that settled in the late afternoons, not the gradual dropping of temperature that evening brought normally, but a sudden, specific cold that arrived like something closing. The clouds changing from the high pewter gray of the previous week to something lower and denser, a cloud base that sat on the hilltops rather than above them. The smell of the air, a metallic, clean smell that had no name in any tongue Mara knew, but that everyone recognized when they put their heads up and breathed it. The birds going quiet. She started bringing in firewood as soon as she noticed the quiet. All of them did, as if the silence communicated something directly, bypassing thought. They made 4 trips down the slope and into the hazel scrub and up again before the light started failing, and what they brought in was stacked against the back wall of the cave in a pile that reached Mara's shoulder. They also brought in the hides that had been drying on the slope outside. They repositioned the sleeping arrangements deeper in the cave. They banked the fire, built it up hot, and then covered it with the densest firewood and a flat stone over the top to keep it slow burning and contained through the night. It began just after dark. The first wind hit the escarpment with a force that surprised even the ones who had been expecting it. It came out of the north, a true winter wind, not the damp autumn winds they had been tolerating, but the real thing, the air mass that had been traveling south from the ice fields far beyond the mountains and had finally arrived. It hit the rock face and the cave entrance with a sound like the world inhaling very fast, and then the snow began. Not soft, floating snow. This was driven snow, horizontal in the wind, more like a spray of ice crystals than anything that could be called flakes. It came past the cave entrance in waves, visible in the firelight as a pale, rushing blur. The temperature dropped fast. They spent the night very close together, all 17 of them packed into the deepest part of the cave with every hide they possessed arranged over and around them. Children between adults for warmth. The fire burning steadily, attended constantly, one person always awake and watching it, because if the fire went out tonight, the consequences were the kind you did not come back from. The wind did not stop. It was the sound as much as the cold that was difficult. A continuous, varying roar that filled the cave and made it hard to hear anything else, including thought. It rose and fell and found harmonics in the rock formations above the cave entrance that were almost musical, a deep oscillating drone that Mara felt in her chest as much as heard. The children were frightened and some of them cried, and the adults held them and made sounds that were not words, and that was all that could be done. In the second night of the storm, Luca went into labor. The pregnancy was early, not catastrophically early, perhaps a few weeks before the expected time, but early enough to matter, early enough to add a specific sharp quality to the already tense atmosphere in the cave. Tala moved immediately, preparing what she had, arranging the space, organizing warmth. She spoke to Luco in a low, continuous voice that was not quite calm but was resolved. The voice of someone who has attended births in terrible circumstances before and has learned that steadiness is a tool. Mara held Luco's hand when asked. She was not skilled in this, was not Tala, did not have Tala's knowledge of the particular geography of birth, but she was present and she was not afraid of the blood and the effort and the sounds that labor produced. And presence without fear was worth something. It took most of the night. The baby was small. She was breathing. She was making the sound that meant breathing, thin and reedy, barely audible above the storm's drone, but present and continuous. Tala wrapped her in the softest available hide and placed her against Luco's skin and covered them both and watched. Outside, the storm went on. The food ran short on the third day. Not dangerously short, not the kind of shortage that kills people quickly, but the kind that makes everything harder and colder and more frightening, because hunger and cold is not linear. The cold takes more from you when you are not eating enough, because the body eats itself to stay warm, and a body eating itself is a body spending down something that cannot quickly be replaced. Mara ate half her portion on the third day and redistributed the rest, giving extra to Luco for the milk and to the children and to Hem, who was suffering most from the cold through his bad hip, which had locked completely and which he was managing with grim stubbornness from his place near the fire. She ate half and did not let anyone see her eating half. If she had seen Kale do the same, she had not known it at the time. Tala burned her last reserve of the resinous leaves on the third afternoon, filling the cave with the sharp, dark smell, speaking to the fire in the old patterned language. Whether she was speaking to the fire or through the fire to something beyond it, Mara could not say and had stopped trying to determine. The ritual was not nothing. The ritual was a way of paying attention to the most important thing, of directing the group's collective focus toward keeping it alive. That was not nothing. She watched Tala work and understood, in a way she had not quite understood before, what the ritual was for. On the morning of the fourth day, the wind stopped. Not gradually, it stopped. The roar cut off between one breath and the next, and the silence that followed was so complete and so sudden that several people woke from sleep immediately, sitting up with the abruptness of people woken by sound rather than silence. It was the silence itself that woke them, the absence of the thing they had been hearing so long that it had become the background condition of existence. Mara was at the cave entrance before anyone else. The world outside was white, not uniformly white. The escarpment face itself was partly clear where the overhang had protected it, and the dark rock of the outcrop above was visible, and the trunks of the birches down the slope showed black against the white ground. But everything horizontal was white, the hillside below and the valley beyond and the sky above, which was a pale, washed blue that looked as if it had been scoured clean by the storm. The cold was extreme. She could feel it landing on her face like something physical, like a pressing of cold hands. She breathed out and her breath appeared and hung in the still air for a moment before dissolving. But the sky was clear. She went back into the cave. "We can hunt today," she said. Part 9. The Return. The hunting was difficult in the snow. The snow was knee-deep in the valley below the escarpment, and deeper in the draws and hollows, and walking through it was exhausting in a way that running on clear ground was not, because every step was a negotiation with the surface. But the snow had other properties that compensated. It held tracks perfectly, better than any soft ground. Every animal that had moved since the storm was legible in the snow, their paths written out across the white surface in a record that a competent tracker could read like a text. Bren read it. He moved through the snow with the particular quality of attention that he brought to tracking, which was not the intense frowning concentration that people who did not track often imagined, but something more like looseness, a wide, receptive awareness that took in the whole field of the snow at once, all the lines and marks and disturbances, and sorted them without force into the significant and the insignificant. He had been doing this since he was old enough to walk, and there was nothing in it any more of effort. It was simply how he saw. "Deer," he said, pointing south. A group, moving slow. Yesterday, moving slow meant wading through deep snow, which meant tired, which meant catchable. They followed the trail for 2 hours, moving carefully to conserve energy, and found the deer in a south-facing bowl below the escarpment where the slope had channeled the wind during the storm and scoured the ground down to barely ankle-deep snow. The deer were there because the shallow snow made feeding possible. They pawed through it to the frozen grass below with the methodical patience of animals that have learned that patience is survival. 6 deer, all of them slowed by the cold and the recent ordeal of the storm. Mara chose 2, a young doe and a small buck whose antlers had recently dropped, which meant his hormones were settling and his meat would not carry the strong rutting taste that made it difficult to eat in quantity. The hunt was efficient, clean. There was a quality to it that she recognized, the quality that came when everyone in a hunting group was experienced and tired and had stopped performing capability and was simply using it. No wasted motion, no posturing. Spears thrown well, angles taken correctly, the animals brought down quickly. Suli's throw on the buck was the best throw Mara had seen in some time. From 40 paces angled downhill into a moving target that was beginning to accelerate. The spear arced and landed exactly where it needed to land, and the buck went down without taking another step. Suli was 16 years old. She looked at Mara after the throw with an expression that was not quite asking for acknowledgement, but was aware that something good had happened. Mara nodded. "That's how it's done," she said. Suli looked at the dead buck and nodded back, and that was all. They came back to the escarpment with 2 deer, and the camp met them the same way it always met a successful hunt. Mara had begun to understand why this ritual mattered. Not the celebration itself, but the reassertion, over and over, that what the hunters brought back belonged to all 17 of them, that the 17 of them constituted something worth bringing it back for. Kale had understood that. She was still in the process of understanding it. 3 days after the storm, Sorn came. He came alone, which was either a gesture of trust or a necessity, or both. He was moving on improvised snowshoes made from bent willow branches and woven bark cord, and they were crude, but they worked. And Mara noted their construction carefully because they had not thought of this. He had meat. He placed it at the foot of the slope without climbing it. 2 pieces of smoked and frozen meat, more fat than muscle, the high-calorie portion. He stepped back from it. Mara went down. She took the meat and held it and looked at him and said thank you in her own tongue, which he could not understand, but the intonation of thank you is not language specific. He said something. He gestured to the escarpment. He gestured south, toward the valley he had described on the hide map. He held up both hands, and then one more finger. 11. He made a question shape with his face. She understood that he was asking if she was managing. 11 might mean the number of people in his group, or it might mean something she was not grasping. But the question shape she understood. She held up both hands, and then 7 fingers. 17. All here. He looked at the number with what seemed like relief, as if his group had worried about hers. She had not expected that. The feeling it produced in her was complicated and warm. She held up a finger. Wait. She went up the slope and came back with the rope. Not the rope she had given him already, but a second length, shorter, that she had made in the cave during the storm with cord material they had. She gave it to him. He took it with 2 hands. He said something that was clearly a sentence, clearly meaningful, clearly not translatable directly, but in the middle of it was a word that sounded close to a word in her tongue. Together, or something in the neighborhood of together. She said it back to him in her own tongue. They stood for a moment in the snow in the clear, cold winter light, with the valley spread out behind him and the escarpment rising behind her, and the word sat between them in the air. Part 10. Winter's arrangement. The winter settled. It was not gentle. It was not the mild season that occasionally arrived. The winter of old people's stories where the snow was thin and the deer were fat and the fires had plenty to eat. This was a winter with ambition, a winter that meant to stay, and it announced its intentions early and maintained them without wavering. The snow on the ground compacted and then froze to a dense crust that would support weight, which was useful for travel, but which made digging through to anything beneath it difficult. The stream below the escarpment froze over, but not completely. The spring flow was strong enough that a stretch of open water remained, covered each night with a skin of new ice that they broke each morning. They learned to live inside the cold the way you learn to live in any environment, by paying attention to it until you understood it, and then by acting on that understanding consistently and without complaint. The fire in the cave entrance was never permitted to go out. Firewood gathering was a daily task. 2 people always, never alone, with the cave within sight or at most within shouting distance. They worked in 2-hour shifts outside and then came in to warm before going out again. They kept the sleeping hides dry by hanging them near the fire during the day and by always removing outer coverings before lying down so that the moisture from a day of moving did not seep into the sleeping skins. They made things. The long dark hours inside the cave were the time for the work that was not hunting and not firekeeping and not childcare. The making of tools, the sewing of hides, the maintenance of equipment, bone needles repaired stitching that had been strained by the move. Flint blades were napped from cores they had carried and given to handles of antler or wood. The atlatls were checked and refinished, the throwing boards straightened over the fire to correct warps that cold and moisture had introduced. Dunn's arm healed. It took most of the early part of the winter, and Tala watched it with the vigilance she brought to everything medical, checking the wound daily for the red lines that meant rot had taken hold inside, pressing the skin around the closure to feel for heat. But the herbs had done their work, and Dunn was young and his body wanted to heal, and it healed. The scar it left was significant, running the inside of his forearm in a thick ridge that would be there for the rest of his life. He did not talk about what had happened with the other group. She did not ask him to. Whatever he had needed to prove, he had proved it to some other standard than the one he had originally intended, and she suspected he was still working out what that meant. One afternoon in the deep winter, perhaps 6 weeks after the storm, she found him sitting near the back of the cave with a flat piece of limestone and a pointed flint tool making marks on the stone. She stopped and looked. The marks were not language, at least not any language she knew. They were shapes, an animal outline that might have been the old bison bull they had hunted on the snow-cleared grassland. The heavy head and shoulder hump rendered in a few lines that captured something true about the animal's weight and presence. Below it, a figure that might have been a person running, the lines suggesting motion in a way she had not seen before in marking making. She looked at the marks for a long time without speaking. He became aware of her and looked up. The expression she expected, the self-consciousness or defensiveness, was not there. He just looked at her. Kale used to make marks, she said. I know, Dunn said. She looked at the limestone piece again. That's good, she said. That's very good. He looked at his work. Not with pride exactly, but with the assessing look of a person who knows that good is not yet good enough and is already thinking about how to get there. She left him to it. The baby lived. Mara watched this with something between relief and wonder, because infant survival in winter was not something to assume. The baby was small, born early, and the winter was hard, and against those facts she had placed Tala's knowledge, Luco's fierce and focused love, the warmth of 17 bodies in a limestone cave, and the fat stores they had built up from the aurochs and the bison and the 2 deer. The fat was the critical variable. Without enough calories, Luco could not have maintained the milk production the infant needed. Without the milk, the infant had nothing, but the fat was there, and Tala knew what she knew. And Luco did not sleep when the infant was cold. She just did not sleep. The weeks reduced her to something lean and hollowed and ferocious, like a blade that has been sharpened too many times. And in that reduction she was somehow more herself than Mara had ever seen her. As if the removal of excess had revealed a core. The baby was named. Tala named her, because naming was one of Tala's functions, a function that went with fire-keeping and mark-making, and knowing the prayer language. The name was a word that in the old speech meant something like the one who arrived in the storm. It was a name that would mean something specific about the world she had arrived in, and something more general about the kind of person who arrives in storms and survives them. Mara liked the name. She said it several times, privately, in different tones, to understand how it sounded. There was contact with Soren's group through the winter. 3 more times, always initiated by Soren, always at the foot of the slope, always with meat or something useful offered from both sides. A system of exchange was developing that had no formal structure, because formal structure was not something either group had language for in common, but that was nonetheless a system, this for that, acknowledging what each side had and needed, with a long-term logic that was not calculation so much as reciprocal attention. Soren's group had stone that was better for certain tools than the local stone they had been working. Mara's group had rope-making skill that produced stronger cord than Soren's people had been able to make. These facts were exchanged. The products of these facts followed. The knowledge itself was the real exchange, though it took some time to figure out how to transfer knowledge when you did not share more than 24 words. Bren figured it out. He sat with 2 of Soren's men for half a day at the foot of the escarpment slope in brutal cold, and demonstrated rope-making technique through repetition and patience and a particular quality of teaching that did not require language, the quality of doing something slowly and clearly, and then watching while the other person tried it, and adjusting what needed to be adjusted, and doing it again. By the time they were done, Soren's men could make a usable length of cord. Mara watched from the cave entrance and thought about what Kale had said. They are people, yes. They were. Part 11. The long melt. The winter broke in the way winters break. Not suddenly, not in a day, but in increments of light. The days began to lengthen so gradually at first that you could not be certain you were seeing it, and not only hoping for it. But the sun's angle changed. Even through the heavy overcast of the deepest winter weeks, the quality of the light was different from what it had been in the dark heart of the season. And as the weeks accumulated, the change became undeniable. The sun was climbing higher on its arc. The afternoons lasted longer. The shadows shifted. The temperature did not follow the light immediately. There were weeks in late winter where the light improved and the cold intensified, the clear nights allowing the accumulated cold of the season to radiate up and out of the ground into the sky, and morning temperatures dropped to extremes that the earlier parts of the winter had not reached. This was the moment when the winter showed what it was actually capable of. And this was also the moment when the food stores were at their lowest. They were surviving. The word had a different quality at this stage of the winter than it had at the beginning. At the beginning, survival was a given, assumed, the background state. Now it was something more specific and earned, a thing they had worked toward through months of daily attention and rationing and firekeeping and hunting and impossible conditions and cooperation and luck. The luck was not insignificant. 2 of Hem's hunting forays had come back with more than she had expected, and she had started to think that the bad hip and the bad teeth and the 50-something winters did not diminish Hem's eye or his patience, both of which were exceptional. Hem was, in fact, the best small-game hunter among them, something that had been true before Kale died, but that she had not fully appreciated because Kale had been in the foreground. She said this to Hem one afternoon, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to be noticed. "I know," he said. She laughed. She had not laughed in some time, and the sound of it surprised her, its own warmth in the cold cave. One afternoon in the late part of the hard winter, when the cave had started to accumulate a particular smell from months of continuous occupation that everyone had become so accustomed to they no longer noticed it, but that fresh air would have made unmistakable, Tala came to sit beside Mara at the fire. This was not unusual. Tala sat beside her often, but tonight she had something in her hands. A small piece of flat limestone, not much larger than a palm, and on it were marks. Mara looked at the marks. They were not Tala's usual marks. They were more carefully made, more considered, the lines precise and the shapes balanced. They showed a group of figures, not individual animals but people, or something suggesting people, shapes that stood upright, arranged in a ring around a central mark that was clearly fire. And around the group of figures, at the edges of the stone, marks that suggested landscape, a cliff face, a stream, hills. It was their camp. this winter. It was the 17 of them, here, at the escarpment. Mara looked at Tala. Tala said, "So that it is remembered." "Who will remember it?" Mara said. Tala put her hand flat on the stone the way she put her hand flat on stone walls, reading whatever she read there. "The stone will," she said. Mara took the piece of limestone and turned it in her hands. The marks were careful and specific. The fire at the center was made with a starburst of fine lines that radiated outward, and the human figures around it were each slightly different from the others, different heights and postures and angles, so that they were recognizably a collection of individuals and not a generic group. She could identify some of them. A tall figure with a slight forward lean that was Bren, a shorter, wider figure with something suggesting a loaded pack that was Tala herself. A very small figure, newer than the others, added last, that sat close to one of the central figures near the fire, the baby, and Luco, and at the back of the group, slightly set apart, a figure that was taller than most of the others, and that stood with a particular stillness that she recognized. "Kale," she said. Tala nodded. "He is still here," Tala said. "When we go, he will still be here. When we come back next summer, he will still be here." Mara held the stone for a long time. She thought about the marks on the bluff at the river camp, the accumulation of seasons on that limestone face, hands pressed against stone, animals taken and gratitude given, a record of things that mattered. She thought about Dunn's bison and charcoal on the piece of limestone in the back of the cave, the animal's weight and presence caught in a few careful lines. She thought, this is also how you survive. Not only food and fire and shelter. This, the making of things that say we were here, and this is what it was, and the stone will remember even if we cannot. She set the marked stone on the ledge above the fire where the warmth could dry it completely, and where everyone could see it. She said, "It is good, Tala." Tala looked at it. "It is a start," she said. The first real thaw came in a morning, arriving with a warmth that was qualitatively different from any of the false thaws of midwinter. It arrived in the south wind, which carried a smell that was not winter's clean metallic cold, but something else, something organic and complicated. The smell of earth beginning to move again, of water returning to places that had been locked and still for months. The snow on the south-facing slope below the escarpment began to pull back from the rock outcrops, the dark stone absorbing the stronger sun and warming from within, the snow retreating at the edges and thinning. The stream below them ran faster. Open water appeared along its whole visible length, the ice retreating to the banks and finally dissolving. Mara stood on the escarpment above the cave entrance and looked south. The valley below was still mostly white, but the white had a different quality than midwinter. It was beginning to have holes in it, dark patches where the ground was asserting itself, and the trees at the valley's edge had a reddish-purple quality about their upper branches that was the first visible sign of what was coming. Bren came and stood beside her. "Aurochs will be moving north by next month," he said. "I know. Sorn's group will go with them," he said. "Back to their summer grounds." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Are we going back to the river camp?" he said. She looked at the valley and thought about the river camp. The bluff face with its accumulated marks, the green river in the mornings, the willows where the lion had stood watching the fire. She thought about the aurochs on the south grassland and the hazel scrub along the water, and the summer abundance that was already implicit in this change of light and wind. "Yes," she said. "We go back in the spring. All 17 of us." He looked at her. He made a small correction, gentle, without emphasis. 18, he said. "The baby." 18, she said. "Yes." Part 12. What remains? Eyes Thea. They left the escarpment when the valley was showing its first serious green, when the birches below the limestone cliff had gone from bare black lines to a haze of new leaves so pale and transparent that the light passed through them and they seemed to glow from inside. The ground was wet everywhere, and the stream below was running high and clear and fast, and the air smelled of mud and new growth, and the particular cold that lives at the intersection of winter and spring, Neither the one thing nor the other. They were a different group than the one that had arrived at the escarpment in the rain and the fear of autumn, not obviously. From a distance, from above, watching them come down the slope with their packs and their poles and their children, you would have seen a band of people moving in the way bands of people moved through this landscape. Purposeful, attentive, the children kept central and the adults spaced to cover the terrain. You would have noted that they moved efficiently, that their loads were well distributed, that there was no confusion about the direction of travel. Looking closer, you would have seen the differences. Dunn walked near the front. Not at the front, which was Mara's position, and not alongside Bren, which was where the best tracker walked, but near the front, close enough to be part of the forward decision-making, and his movement through the terrain had changed from the slightly performative quality of the previous summer to something quieter and more functional. The scar on his forearm was visible below the edge of his sleeve when his pack shifted. He did not appear to think about it. Luco walked steadily. Tala's child-carrying frame adapted around her shoulders to take the infant, who rode against Luco's chest, wrapped in the softest available hide, her head visible above the carrying strap's edge. The baby was not large, but she was alert, her dark eyes moving over the landscape with the unfocused attention of very young things, taking it all in without knowing what any of it was. She would learn. That was the point of the eyes, the point of the attention, to begin the work of learning what the world was, so that it could be navigated, so that it could be survived. Hem walked. He walked with difficulty, and he walked without complaint, using a staff he had made during the winter from a piece of ash that Bren had split for him and that he had worked down to a smooth, well-balanced length over the dark months. He was not fast. The group moved at his pace, which was slower than it would otherwise have been, and no one appeared to notice this or to calculate the time it added to the journey, and if anyone did notice or calculate, they kept it internal, because the calculation was obvious on its face. Hem walked because they needed Hem. Suli walked. She had at some point during the winter passed through a change that Mara could not name precisely, the change from a remarkable young person into a skilled adult. It had happened without announcement, the way most important things happened. She now moved through the landscape with the self-possession of someone who knew what she was doing, and what she was doing was significant enough not to require display. Tala walked at the back. This was her habitual position on any journey, chosen because the back was where you could see the whole group at once, and because the back was where a thing left behind would be noticed first. She carried less than she had the previous autumn, because the winter had used some of what she carried, and the freed space in her pack had been filled with things that were not food or tool, but something else. The marked stones, the flat piece of limestone with the winter encampment on it, the ochre bundles, a piece of birch bark on which Dunn had transferred the bison drawing with a careful hand and a charcoal stick. The drawing translated from stone to bark, and not lost. They were carrying the winter with them. Not the misery of it, not the hunger or the cold, but the winter as it had actually been, something survived and learned from, and made into knowledge that could be carried forward. Mara walked at the front. She thought about Kale on the rock above the escarpment, the marks Tayla had made for him there. She thought about the marks he had made himself on the bluff at the river camp, and the ones that had been there before him, the accumulated seasons. She thought about Soren's group moving southwest toward their valley, the map marked on a piece of thin-scraped hide passing between two people who had less than 50 words in common. She thought about the rope she had given him and the snowshoes she had noted and not had to ask about, because the knowledge was available in the object itself, the bent willow branches and the bark cord saying, "Look at this. This is how it is done." She thought, knowledge moves. That is the thing that is not obvious, but that Kale knew and Tala knows, and that she was beginning to understand herself. Everything else a person builds can be destroyed. The camp, the fire, the food store, the body itself. But the knowledge that produces these things, the pattern underneath them, the understanding of which plants heal and which stone naps cleanest and how the weather smells before a storm and where the deer go when the deep cold comes, This moves between people the way fire moves from one held stick to another, and it does not diminish in the giving, it only grows. This was what the marks on stone were for. This was what Tala's prayer language was for. This was what Dunn's bison on birch bark was for, and Soren's map on scraped hide, and Hem's advice about the south-facing hollows where the snow was thin, given quietly to Bren on a morning when the hunting was impossible and instruction was the only productive use of the time. The knowledge moves, you pass it, you receive it, you add to it what you have found, and you pass it again. The world is large and it does not care about any single person in it. It does not care about hunger or cold or loss. The Aroax does not concern itself with the people who need to eat. The winter does not notice the fire. The cave lion, magnificent and indifferent in the willows by the river, watching the camp's firelight with its amber eyes, does not know that it is feared or respected or that it has entered the dreams of the people who have seen it. But the people know these things. The people know them and they keep the knowing and they give it forward. And what survives is not any individual person but the long thread of knowing that runs through all of them, back through their parents and their parents' parents, and forward into the dark, into children not yet born, into lives that will happen in places no one living has yet imagined. Mara walked at the front. The river valley opened below them as they crested the last hill, spreading south and gold in the spring light. The river visible as a line of silver through the new green of the valley floor. The willows along its banks gone the vivid yellow-green of their early leafing. The limestone bluff was there, patient and unchanged, its face catching the morning light. She stopped. The group spread out behind her on the hill crest and stopped with her. Everyone was looking at the valley. No one spoke for a moment. Then the baby made a sound. Not crying. Something that was not crying. A sound of attention, of the eyes and the chest opening toward something new. The valley below, spreading and golden. The river and the bluff and the particular blue of the sky above it, seen for the first time by eyes that were only months old. "What is it?" Luco said softly to the infant. "What do you see?" The baby looked. Mara put one foot in front of the other and started down the hill. The others followed. They came down into the valley as the sun climbed and the shadows shortened, and the birds were loud in the willows along the water, and the grass underfoot was damp and lush and full of the smell of everything waking up. The bluff face came into view as they rounded the last stand of trees, and the marks were there, the old marks, exactly where they had always been. Tala walked past Mara without slowing and went directly to the bluff face. She stood before it for a moment. Then she pressed her palm against the stone, flat and certain, in the place below the marks, in the open space that was waiting. She held it there. She would make new marks. Not today, perhaps, but soon. "The fire," Mara said, and they began.